So this presentation is regarding import considerations and licensing requirements. So we're now going to explore a little bit more on the practical side of getting your food into Canada. This will include more details on the licensing structure, how food safety and labeling influence the import process, and how you can support your Canadian importer to ensure success at the border. So session overview for this one. So this session, again, we'll continue from our earlier discussion, but now we're going to shift our focus to how the process works in practice. We're going to cover each item shown here in this slide. So things like licensing, the import process, label and document compliance, food safety, certifications, importer and broker roles, those errors in my CFIA tools in much more detail, and some high risk commodity considerations as well. So very similar to session one, at the end of the session, we'll have a Q&A aspect. So please note any questions you have throughout, and we'll go over those at the end. So in this second session, we'll go over how Canadian importers meet regulatory obligations and how the exporter plays a critical role in them being able to do that. We'll highlight some practical tips, common mistakes, and the key documents and certifications that can help you avoid problems at our border. So hopefully by the end of this session, you'll understand the essential steps, risks, and strategies to import food into Canada efficiently. So another introduction to food importation in Canada. Some of this we will have already talked about in our first session, but when you export food to Canada, it's your Canadian partner who is legally responsible for that import under Canadian law. So importers are the ones who have to hold the license, the Safe Food for Canadians license, in order to import food products into the country. And the importer is ultimately responsible for ensuring the products imported are safe and compliant. They will be the ones that are held responsible by the Canadian government agencies if anything happens or is non-compliant when it enters the country. So the role of the exporter is just as important though. Exporters must ensure that the products they're sending to Canada meet those Canadian standards and that all necessary documentation and traceability information is available and complete. The importer will rely on the exporter to help them meet their licensing obligations. The importer certainly can't do all of this by themselves. And it's definitely in the exporter's best interest to ensure everything is compliant as well, because importers, if there's compliance issues, they may cease to work with exporters that are having issues maintaining their compliance. So the best way to think about this, it's a partnership really between the importer and the exporter. Both parties will rely on each other to ensure that their requirements are met. And so together you're responsible for making sure that the product is safe, properly labeled, and ready to enter Canada. So just a little more specifically, if a Costa Rican company wants to export their food products to Canada, the Canadian importer would be the one that's required to have the license, and they need to work with that importer in order to compliantly ship their products into Canada. So some SFCR licensing requirements. So generally, only Canadian entities can apply for and hold an SFC license. There are certain instances where foreign entities can hold a version of these, but that's quite uncommon and not really something that we're going to cover due to how infrequent that is. So the exporter must understand what the importer's license covers and how you fit into your importer's food safety system. So basically, their SFC license must authorize import as an activity. You can also have SFC licenses that are for manufacturing. So if a Canadian company has a manufacturing license, they can't necessarily import your products unless they add the activity of import to their license. So these are specific to the activity being conducted by the Canadian entity. So again, exporters support that compliance, which means supplying the importer with those relevant documents, such as things like the traceability, so batch codes, ingredient supplier information, batch records, certifications, if the exporter has any, So again, things like HACCP, GFSI, or PCP documents. So we did mention in the questions there that if your manufacturer has a PCP in place already, that's definitely something that you can provide to your importer, which will be very helpful. And even if your local authority doesn't require it for export for the PCP, it's a good practice to have it in place and to ask your manufacturer to implement them. And then your label artwork as well is another key component that your importer will need. So if the exporter documentation is unavailable or incomplete, then the importer will not be able to clear the shipment, and that will cause delays, sometimes for several days, even weeks, depending on the severity of the issue. And eventually, if you can't clear the issue, your product will be returned or destroyed. If your importer is audited or inspected by CFIA, they may be asked to produce documentation that you have to provide, or your manufacturer in some cases. So that's why having all these things in place, your labels, your certificates, test results, and those PCP summaries must be accurate and readily available. This isn't something that you can make on the fly when it's requested. You'll have to have it in place in advance in order to be able to meet the timelines of those requests. So the exporter does not need to hold the license, but your performance will directly affect your importer's compliance and the status of their license. So the import process and border controls. Once your product is shipped, in practice, your importer will handle the formal import process. They will be the ones that declare the product, provide the documents, and respond to any inspection requests from CFIA or the CBSA. I mentioned earlier about the CFIA's risk-based approach, which they use for all shipments. So if your product comes from a higher risk category, or if the importer or the brand itself has had any past violations, then you run the higher risk of being inspected or sampled at the border. So the CFIA may request an inspection of your product. They may request to sample it for testing, or they may simply clear that shipment immediately, depending on, again, that risk-based approach and what they decide to do. Some things do also just get randomly inspected. It's not necessarily that your product is high risk or you have a compliance issue. If you get flagged for an inspection, it does occur randomly as well. So shipments that fail those inspections can be refused entry, held at the port, or even destroyed, which can obviously be very costly for you as the exporter. So that's why it's critical to understand these processes and have the systems and the documents in place so you can follow those Canadian requirements in advance and avoid these types of problems. So in working with your importer, you should develop a pre-clearance relationship. So that is things like providing them with all documentation in advance of the shipment so they have the opportunity to review and let you know if anything needs to be changed. Again, the more time that you can give to have these things reviewed, the better chance that any issues will be caught and rectified before the shipment gets stopped. So label compliance and documentation review. We talked quite a bit in the first presentation about label compliance as well, and we're really harping on it because it is one of those most common failure points in the import process, probably the most common, especially that we see. So understanding those label requirements that we talked about in the first session and having proper support in that area are critical for the success of your exports. So just to reiterate some of the label requirements, they must be bilingual in both Canadian languages, English and French. They must follow our specific formatting requirements for the nutrition facts table, or if your product is a supplemented food, your supplemented food facts table. And the ingredient list. The ingredients must be listed in the correct order, which in general for Canada is descending order of predominance by weight. And they must make properly formatted allergen statements and much more. We covered that in a bit more detail in the first session. So if the product makes health or nutrient content claims, those must also meet the thresholds. So there are specific amounts a given ingredient or nutrient must meet in order to make specific nutrient content claims. So as a specific example of that, if you want to say a product is a source of a vitamin, maybe vitamin C in this example, so source of vitamin C on your label, then vitamin C needs to have an established daily value, and your product needs to be providing at least 5% of that daily value in order to say that it's a source of vitamin C. So, and then there's different thresholds. So if you add more, maybe if you're more around like 30% vitamin C of the daily value, then you start to be able to open up claims like good source or high in and things like that. So the point being, there's very specific standards that have to be met to make those claims, and you'll definitely need to ensure you're meeting those if you are saying anything like that on your labels. So then along with your label, your importer will need documents that show what your product contains, how it was made, and where it came from. So that can be things like batch records from your manufacturer, production records, maybe even farm records if it came directly from a farm, things like that to support its origins. And this documentation package will support their licensing obligations and help you avoid those delays at the border. So another point that we like to harp on too is that using nutrition facts tables from other countries does not necessarily mean they're compliant for Canada. A good example of this is FDA compliant nutrition facts tables. Sometimes those can meet Canadian requirements, but oftentimes there's formatting differences or minor things that are not the same. So I've personally seen compliant US products stopped at the border because they were not compliant with those Canadian nutrition facts table formatting, or obviously the French requirements as well. So ensure your importer has sufficient time to review your labels for compliance. And I would recommend providing your labels to your importer well in advance of your shipments. So if you provide labels a day or a couple of days before a shipment is sent, you're much less likely to catch issues in advance and more likely to end up with a stopped shipment. And if you provide things that late, even if your importer does catch an issue, you'll be slowed down as you'll need to relabel or sticker over the issue on your labels, which can be very costly and it will take time. So having those done weeks in advance is generally the recommended practice. And it's a good idea to send them your mock label in just PDF format well before you print it on your bottles, so that if there is any issues, you can correct it before you go to print. It's also a good practice to hire a Canadian consultant to conduct label compliance reviews before starting this import process. Those consultants have vast experience dealing with the label compliance process. They know them inside and out and backwards. So having them review your labels beforehand is definitely recommended. So some food safety requirements for imported goods. The big key here is that the Canadian Food Inspection Agency does not adjust food safety expectations for imported goods. So your products will need to be as safe and well documented as if they were made in Canada. So that's why all these documentation requirements that we have here, you pretty much need to implement on your end as well to ensure that they meet our standards. So that means having a food safety system in place. So those preventative control plans, including those hazard controls, sanitation and allergen procedures, and test results. So this all relates back to that preventative control plan and the items in there for controlling hazards, as well as testing the product to ensure it's safe. So the best approach here is to align your programs with global standards, like Codex HACCP, which is Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Points, or a GFSI recognized scheme that we discussed in our first session a little bit, such as the BRC, Global Standard for Food Safety, or SQFI, which is the Safe Quality Food Institute. So these internationally recognized standards improve importer confidence and simplify the border process because they improve the CFIA's confidence as well. They will feel better about your shipments knowing that you're meeting these global standards. So certification and equivalency programs. We're going to go a little more in depth into these certifications here to kind of help exemplify why they can help you. So certifications help signal that your facility and processes meet international expectations. Canadian retailers and food service companies often require GFSI recognized food safety certifications from their suppliers. So we've already mentioned the BRCGS, SQF, and FSSC 22000, which are globally recognized food safety management system certification schemes. Organic certification is one that many brands want to have and strive to have, so it's very strictly enforced in Canada. So here it's called the Canada Organic Regime, is the body that oversees organic certification processes. So they are the ones who must certify any food product making an organic claim in Canada. So this includes products labeled as organic, bearing the Canada Organic logo, which is shown on the slide, or declaring things like contains X% organic ingredients and statements of that nature. So if Canada has an equivalency agreement with another country, other countries' organic certifications may also be recognized. So a good example of this is with the United States. So the USDA organic is considered equivalent to the Canada Organic regime. So USDA organic certifications are acceptable in Canada. So more specifically for organic certification in Canada, products containing over 95% organic ingredients are simply labeled organic with no associated percentage, and they may use the Canada Organic logo. So that 95% is the minimum threshold. If your product has 100% organic ingredients, you still just get to call it organic and add that Canada Organic logo, the same as if it had 95%. You're not permitted to put a percentage. Products that are within 70 to less than 95% organic ingredients may state that they are made with X% amount of organic ingredients, but they may not claim to be organic, and they may not use the Canada Organic logo shown here. So as an example, if you're using 80% organic ingredients in your product, your label can say made with 80% organic ingredients, but you can't call the product organic and you can't add the organic logo to it. And then anything below that 70% threshold may not make organic claims of any nature in Canada. So in some countries, you'll see things where single ingredients are called out, with statements that say made with organic vitamin C or whatever, for example. Those types of statements in Canada are not permitted. If you have less than 70% organic ingredients, you're not permitted to make organic claims of any kind. There are also other certificates like halal and kosher that are, typically buyer specific, but sometimes are things that people want to see. So you would be speaking with your purchaser about that if that's something that they require. So providing certifications like these speeds up product approvals. It reduces the likelihood of those stoppages and inspections with CFIA and CBSA. And it helps your importer satisfy their due diligence obligations under their license. So these really just help provide confidence that your system is effective at establishing the safety of the products that you export. Having said all that, these certifications are not required under Canadian law. So even if you don't have any of these, you can still export your food products to Canada as long as your buyer doesn't require these certifications. There's no requirement to have them with our government agencies. So it's not something that needs to discourage you from exporting your products to Canada if you don't have any of these, but they are good things to consider adding, and they will help with your buyers as well. So the role of importers and brokers, Your importer is essentially your key partner. So they're the ones who are responsible for that legal compliance in Canada, as we mentioned. Your partners in compliance, and both of you will rely on each other to ensure all regulatory requirements are met. This relationship can vary depending on the importer. Some companies do it different than others. Some importers will handle everything directly, while others may work with a customs broker. So customs brokers may specialize in managing the paperwork and liaising with CFIA and CBSA. So even if you do use a customs broker, you have to have an importer because you have to have somebody who holds the license, but your importer may use a broker to actually do a lot of this paperwork with CFIA and CBSA, just depending on their business practice. So some tips to avoid problems. Send your full documentation package well in advance. Respond quickly to any requests. You may get requests from your importer or from the CFIA during these processes. So quick responses really help move things along. And make sure your partners are aligned with your production schedule. So make sure everyone's well aware of when your shipments will be coming so that they can prepare in advance. Issues will typically arise from things like last minute communication if you're trying to rush a shipment in to meet a deadline with a buyer, things like that. You want to avoid that as much as possible because it can cause issues with the regulatory process. Sending incomplete or outdated documents and assuming the importer will catch all your issues. The importers should know all these requirements, and they will review all your stuff, but they may miss information as well. So the more prepared your documents are on your end, the less likely you are to have any issues. So the best exporters maintain clear communication, provide updated documentation regularly, and flag changes proactively. So another thing to consider here is that if you make even what you would consider to be a minor change to your label or to a process or a document that you typically use for import, you do need to go through the approval process again with your importer and provide those documents to them. Again, even minor labeling changes can cause big problems because even if you consider the change to be minor, if it causes a compliance issue, that can be what ends up stopping your shipment from clearing. So basically, anytime you make a change to your labels or your processes, you'll want to have those re-reviewed. Okay, so use of AIRS and my CFIA tools. So we talked about these briefly in the first session, and I said we would get into more detail of them, which we'll do here. So AIRS is the CFIA's automated import reference system. So this is a public database that shows Canadian import requirements for specific food products based on their origins. And it's kind of your window into CFIA's expectations. So you can look this up online. And if you go to the AIRS website, you'll see an option right on the front page to either launch the portal to use AIRS, or there's a tutorial. So the tutorial is pretty helpful, especially the first time you use this tool. Definitely recommend checking that out so you kind of know how to use it and you can learn how it works. So once you go into the AIRS portal, you can use it to look up your product by HS code or keyword search. So you should be able to find your product. You'll go through a series of menus selecting your exact product, its country of origin, all that sort of stuff. And then once you get through all that and fill in all the information, it'll tell you exactly what document requirements you need for importing that product. So as an example, if you're going to ship frozen shrimp from Costa Rica into Canada, and you looked that up, AIRS would tell you that you would need a certificate from the Costa Rican Competent Authority in order to do that as an additional documentation requirement. So it's very helpful in determining the specific document requirements for your exact product that you intend to export, because again, all the general documents will be fairly consistent across product types, but certain things will require more documents or different documents. So this tool is a great way to check that out. Your importer should also be able to help you with this. So if you're having trouble with AIRS, you can always speak to them, and they should be able to look it up for you. The My CFIA tool is the other main one that the CFIA uses, but that one is typically for importers. So the importer will use My CFIA to submit the paperwork requirements that were established in AIRS, essentially. So AIRS tells you what you need. My CFIA is how you submit it. So exporters will not be using My CFIA, but if you know how it works, it can help you prepare everything for your importer in time. I've touched on these a few times, but we're going to go into a little more detail on high-risk commodities and how to handle them. So high-risk food categories often require some additional documentation in order to import. So you're exporting things like meat, seafood, any unpasteurized juices, fresh produce, or other high-risk items, you'll need to follow some specific protocols in order to export those. So this is product dependent, so it depends on exactly what you're exporting, but this can include things like being listed as an approved foreign establishment. So sometimes foreign manufacturers need to be licensed in order to make high-risk products that are coming to Canada. Providing a veterinary or phytosanitary certificate or some additional testing for particular contaminants, for things like Listeria, Salmonella, or histamines, just depending on your particular product and what might be of concern in it. So it's a good idea to start by checking with your own food authority. So your country's food authority export documentation will need to match CFIA's expectations exactly. So whatever export documents you are getting from your competent authority, those requirements will have to be met in there for CFIA to accept these high-risk materials. So if you are exporting things like this, allow for extra time to set up your exporting process. It will take a little bit longer, probably, just depending on the document requirements and having your importer set this up with CFIA. And another thing to think about is high risk does not mean high failure. It does not mean that you can't export these to Canada. They certainly can be brought into the country. It just requires more attention to detail and more associated documentation. Some practical tips for smooth imports. So to make your exports run smoothly, the best piece of advice I can give is to be proactive. Be prepared well in advance. Don't try to rush things through to meet deadlines. Do this well in advance of when you need to ship the product. Last minute submissions are far more likely to have issues and result in stoppages than those that are prepared well in advance. So have your documents and labels reviewed at least 2 weeks before shipping is generally what I would say. The earlier the better though. So if you know you're 3 months away from shipping to Canada, it's never too early to get started on the process with your importer. Having all this done as early as possible will allow you sufficient time to make any adjustments needed, especially if it's label adjustments, things you might have to reprint. That can take a significant amount of time. So having more time in advance will help you with that. Another good tip for this is conducting internal audits. So have a look at your own procedures in depth and evaluate their compliance. Go through the process yourself, whether that's with a mock recall or a traceability test. Make sure you can trace your entire product back to suppliers, and can you trace it after it leaves your facility and where it went. Putting these systems in place on your end just helps you be proactive and avoid issues. Batch codes, make sure those are clear and consistent. Again, the batch codes on the physical units need to match those in the documentation. Another part of this I haven't discussed as much today is ensuring your batch codes are unique and never reusing them. Reusing a batch code can cause the same issues as using an inconsistent one. So if you've used a batch code in the past and you try to use it again, it causes confusion with CFIA in your documents. So using a single unique batch code for every batch you produce is key to keeping this consistent. Communicate early and regularly with your importer. We've talked about that several times throughout these presentations, but that communication really is the key to all of this functioning effectively. And use a pre-shipment checklist. So ensure you have all your requirements covered on the checklist. I've shared a couple examples of that with you today that you can kind of base your own on as well. But developing your own that are specific for your product will really help you, ensuring that you've covered everything before you go to market. And make sure you use them if you do develop them. So go over these checklists yourself before each shipment to catch any issues. Don't rely on your importer to catch every issue. Maintaining organized digital export files is another really big part of this. So C of A's, certificates, and shipping documents. When the CFIA goes to review your documents, you want them to be able to easily understand what they're looking at very quickly. So the more organized it is, the more clearly labeled everything is, the easier that will be for CFIA. So exporters who communicate clearly with their Canadian partners and anticipate issues in advance are the ones who are more successful in the long term. A few extra steps before you ship your product can really help you prevent costly delays or even rejections at the port of entry. So taking your time and being a little bit later on your shipping is better than having help or destroyed. So some common mistakes to avoid. We talked about these in our first session as well, but those were a little bit more general. So here we're focusing on specific issues to the import and licensing process. So problems will often arise when your documentation doesn't reflect the most current production run, conflicting data between C of A's and specifications, or unannounced label changes. When exporters assume Canadian requirements match other markets, so they typically don't. Canada has very specific requirements, so compliance somewhere else does not mean that your product is compliant for Canada. You need to make sure that it's specifically compliant for the Canadian market. And again, a label that meets, FDA standards, for example, won't necessarily meet CFIA's. So having those reviewed for Canada specifically is very important. And CFIA increasingly expects controls for allergens, listeria, and undeclared ingredients to be documented. So having that documentation to back the safety of your product is a key aspect to all of this. Make sure your importer knows well in advance if anything's changed with the product or with the labels or your documents. This will help you avoid costly relabeling and shipment holds. And again, don't over rely on your importer to check your compliance. Develop an internal system to check yourself before your shipments are sent. That'll help you avoid issues, and you won't be relying on your importer to catch any of your mistakes. So that is the end of our second presentation. So in this we covered the need for SFCR licensing and how it fits into import roles, some practical import process realities and how to reduce your risks, the critical nature of label compliance and food safety documentation, why certifications matter and why you should consider adding them if you don't have them already, and some tools and strategies to reduce your shipment delays. So our goal today was to make your Canadian food imports seamless, compliant, and profitable. Hopefully we've been able to do that. And I'll now open this up to any questions you guys have regarding this presentation.
I'll have one question if you don't mind.
For sure, go ahead.
Yeah, it's about have to avoid the NPN process, because when you put when you define a product by its medicinal properties, then you have to go through the NPN process in Canada, National Product Number. So I was wondering, writing a general terminology like say immunobooster, for example, for a green tea or something, will it force us to go through that process and apply to get an NPN number for that product, or it's something like it's a sale of food? It's like normal tea that you can avoid that process. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So yeah, there's a fine line between what is considered a food and a natural health product for sure. So there's two major aspects to that. The first being your ingredients. So sometimes there are ingredients that specifically have to be a natural health product or a food. But the more common classification is the representation of the product. So how you market the product, the claims on it, and how you intend to sell it in the market. So there are functional claims that are available for foods, such as like immune boosting. It doesn't necessarily classify it as a natural health product at that point, as long as you can support it on your food product and you're marketing your product as food. So a key aspect of that, foods are typically consumed in one sitting, whereas a natural health product may be, multiple doses over a period of time. It can be things like where it's sold in stores. Is your product in the food section with other foods, or is it sold, in the health section with the other vitamins? Those types of things all kind of play a role in classifying your product. So it's not a super straightforward line between an NHP and a food. There's a lot of factors that kind of go into it. So if you're unsure, it's a good idea, again, to have a consultant look at that and help you classify it. But the short answer to your question, like saying things like immune boosting and things like that, don't necessarily make it a natural health product. If you're crossing over into things like, helps treat or helps prevent a disease or things like that, those are crossing into natural health product territory for sure. So it's it's a fine line, if that kind of answers your question.
Sure, thank you.
No problem. I do have a couple of frequently asked questions that we get that I can cover, just in case anybody has the same question and doesn't want to ask it. So one thing that we get asked a lot is, if I'm using a customs broker, can they handle compliance, or do you still need to have an importer? So customs brokers typically don't have SFC licensing. So you still need the importer that has that license, unless you're finding a customs broker that has both. But so customs brokers are essentially there to help you face to face with the CBSA. They are very good at handling and clearing shipments, but you still need the importer to be your license holder on the back end, if that makes sense. And then another one is like, what's a document list of an example shipment for documents that we'll need to send to Canada. So typically there's your label artwork, your certificate of analysis or test results for the batch, packing slip, invoice, bill of lading for the shipment, any allergen declarations and product specifications, and then that traceability aspect. So batch records, batch codes, and things like that. And then again, we can get more specific documents as well, depending on the exact product, but those are kind of the main general ones. And so if any of you would like to book a consultation with us, there's a QR code on the screen there, or you can contact us at any of the details that are provided on the screen.
Thank you, Drake. I think Eve has a question. I see a hand.
Yes, that's about, like, he asked a little bit about this importers question. So my idea was mostly to ask where we can find a list of importers, for example, that we can trust, and also as a small companies, we can get some maybe discounts or something like that. Because I guess all this paperwork, all these different process that you have to supply, you have a high cost. Or I don't know how this works.
Yeah, great question. Hopefully I got all that. You broke up a little bit there for me. But as far as a list of importers, there's not really a public list of importers that you can use to look up. You can Google search food importers in Canada, and you'll definitely get some results that way. And then again, we can also assist you if that's something that you're looking for. But there's plenty of companies that do offer it as a service. So looking it up should give you some pretty good results and options and who can help you. And then I think I missed the second part of your question there.
It was about if we are small companies, because obviously I expect all this paperwork is very expensive because I don't know, we did the FDA, but it was expensive, but I see for Canada it's more details or more like work is required of the building. So I don't know. So if a small company can afford that kind of the process.
Good question. Yeah, there's definitely an expense to it. They don't make it super straightforward to export stuff here. So the testing is probably the biggest expense. I don't know if you're already testing your products, then you would have that expense anyway. But if you're not, that would be the biggest probably added expense for Canada. The rest of the documentation didn't cost too much. Obviously, the certifications, if you're looking at getting certifications, those cost a fair bit at times. But the actual like traceability records and things like that, there shouldn't be too much of a cost associated with those types of things.
Thank you.
No problem.
Well, thank you very much, Drake. It's the interesting and useful information.
Of course, thank you all for joining. It was great presenting to you today. Hopefully you learned something. And again, if you guys need any assistance, you can feel free to reach out.
Perfect. Thank you, Drake. And we hope this information was valuable for you as well. And we'll be sharing the presentation shortly. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Have a good day.